So,
hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for bearing with us. I'm Emma Koval. I'm Professor of Anthropology at Deakin University and Deputy Director of the Alfred Deakin Institute and co-theme leader with Jeff Craig of the Healthy Societies theme of the Science and Society Network. So I'll just briefly introduce Professor Luis Campos, who is Baker College Chair for the History of Science, Technology and Innovation at Rice University, author of many books in the history of genetics and the history of biological engineering. And following his talk that we're about to hear, we will have discussant comments from Professor Alice Poubet and also Dr. Evie Kendall, and then we will open out to questions from the audience. So I think we are now ready, Luis, for you to come up and...
Let me just make sure that... Well, now if we put the slides on. Okay. Will it? Or do we have to change the thing? Yeah. Okay.
Is that visible online?
The slides?
Or can someone see?
Can you see them?
I see them.
The screens to the laptop because it's not on the laptop. Okay. This my laptop, right? No. Yes. Yes. Okay.
That looks good. And is it online? Yes.
There's a little bit of a lag with online. So they can see you, which is a great start. And yes, they should be able to see you now. All right. Yeah, they can see you, and I'm afraid they can't see the slides. I'm so sorry. Is that okay for us to enjoy the slides?
Sure. Yeah.
And I'll try and fix that in the background.
Okay.
While you go.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Emma, and thank you everyone who's online. I think I can almost see you there. So what is Asilomar, and why does it get invoked so much in contemporary biotechnology? So first and foremost, Asilomar is a place. It's a beautiful place on the Monterey Peninsula of California. It's a conference center on the grounds of an old religious retreat center. And secondly, Asilomar is an event. It's a 4-day meeting that took place in February of 1975 involving some of the most famous names in the history of molecular biology. As Sidney Brenner once said, for the first time, there's now a direct method which allows us to cross very large evolutionary barriers and to move genes between organisms which have never had genetic contact. Or as Robert Sinsheimer put it, what this technology does is to make available to us the complete gene pool of evolution. We can take the genes of one organism and recombine them with those of others in any manner that we wish. To my mind, that is an accomplishment as significant as the splitting of the atom, he said. The meeting also proved to be an inflection moment for new biosafety procedures and laboratory design. Among other things, it further developed the BSL physical containment system and tried to integrate both physical and biological containment mechanisms by proposing the development of disarmed host strains. And finally, Asilomar, for a third answer, is a spirit, as in the spirit of Asilomar, which has haunted the world of science policy. For 48 years, Asilomar has been a prominent touchstone for many contemporary discussions about what it means to conduct ethical and socially responsible research in biological engineering and in other fields. See if we have our slides coming through.
It's just a lag, so we'll see.
And for the next few slides,
yes,
just want to...
Yes, we're on.
Now it is, okay. So I'll go back and show you the fun slide that those in the online world had missed here about biological and physical containment mechanisms here. But for these other slides, I thought I'd just show you some images from some more recent scientific articles that you may have seen, where people invoke the lessons of Asilomar over many years and refer to it again and again. In 2000, at the 25th anniversary of Asilomar, Science magazine reported that the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA was the Woodstock of molecular biology. And the author went on to ask, was it something that could or even should be repeated? But once you know what Asilomar is, you can't help but see it everywhere in the literature, surrounding even the most contemporary of developments. So there are some references here to the spirit of Asilomar that occurs, or here lessons for human germline editing, genic modification, CRISPR. Again, are we at a point for a new Asilomar, an Asilomar for nanotech? Are we after Asilomar? And even for AI principles. In fact, just a couple months ago, I saw this most recent one, a call for an Asilomar for cultivated meat and seafood. So this becomes a generic brand or a topic for all sorts of possible things that travel under this name. Now, as a historian of science, I don't usually get to offer charts in my presentations, but in deference to our interdisciplinary context, I thought I would offer this Google Ngram, showing the frequency of Asilomar as it appears in the corpus of English language published work scanned by Google up until recent years. You can ignore that early bump when Asilomar was established as a spiritual retreat center, but I see three moments of interest here. A significant increase in the early 1970s, peaking in these years, let's call it the Asilo Mount, just after this 1975 meeting, and then continuing on fairly steadily for years since, which we might refer to as the spirit of Asilomar. So I think there are many aspects of this meeting that we can consider. The ethical motivations and concerns at the time, which involved consideration of potential hazards to public health, the solutions and resolutions following the Asilomar meeting, not only to understand historically what was decided at Asilomar itself, but also to trace the ways in which this meeting has been invoked and was invoked, and to study how ethics get deployed as tactics for competing legacies. And third, then, these purported lessons of Asilomar, seen through later cases, including through the case of synthetic biology that I'll finish with later today, as it's developed since 2004. And this might help us think a little bit more deeply about what we're doing when we think we're engaging in productive discussions over socially responsible research when we invoke this meeting of Asilomar. Or, if I can put this another way, I want to focus on the specters that haunted Asilomar and brought it about. The spirit of Asilomar, as described by those who were there and who helped transform these guidelines into national and international policies. And finally, how the ghost of Asilomar continues to haunt these contemporary discussions. So how could you go wrong in a very nice place, Jim Watson once wondered. This is one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA when he thought back on what happened at this meeting at Asilomar. So beginning on February 24th of 1975, this famous 4-day International Congress on Recombinant DNA Molecules, as it was called, was held amid a rustic collection of cabins and meeting halls folded into the redwoods and pines on the Pacific coast of California, we're told. It was here at this so-called sea haven of enchantment for the conferee or the vacationer, what they referred to as a refuge by the sea, which is where the invented name of Asilomar comes from, according to a brochure that was written in 1973. That over 130 invited scientists, 82 Americans and 52 from other countries, as well as 4 legal experts, arrived to hash out the potential perils of the novel recombinant DNA technology, all while being observed by 16 journalists. This is not your ordinary meeting. So as the monarch butterflies covered the peninsula as part of their annual migration, the scientists arrived to settle some nervous butterflies of their own and to hash out what it might mean to deal with these new technologies. So this meeting at Asilomar had been called to discuss lifting a voluntary moratorium on new kinds of research that had recently been enacted concerning some kinds of potentially hazardous experiments involving either antibiotic resistance or even more concerningly, new kinds of viruses that it was feared might cause pandemics. And they wanted to produce new guidelines for research. So you can see here how this is described by a historian then in the early to mid 1990s who's written one of the most remarkable accounts of this meeting, and noting how momentous this pause was that molecular biologists had taken to assess how genetic engineering should proceed. Right? This was, she says here, a nearly unprecedented event in the history of science. So concerns have first been raised at a smaller meeting at Asilomar in January 22nd to the 24th of 1973, which was known in retrospect as Asilomar 1, and which was published in a volume called Biohazards in Biological Research. There was then a follow-up conversation that took place at the Gordon Conference on Nucleic Acids in June of 1973, where at that conference they announced that new kinds of hybrid plasmids or viruses with biological activity of an unpredictable nature may eventually be created. And they said certain such hybrid molecules may prove hazardous to laboratory workers and to the public. Although no such hazard has yet been established, they wrote, prudence suggests that the potential hazard be seriously considered. Now, journalists' attention had been drawn to this matter when Maxine Singer and Dieter Zoll published a letter in Science in 1973, then calling for the creation of a committee to investigate the potential consequences of in vitro genetic manipulation, which was then followed up in the US by a 1974 National Academies Committee that addressed these hazards, led by Paul Berg. Berg then led the writing of an open letter known as the Berg Letter that called for this moratorium on these two kinds of experiments until a larger discussion could take place. Again, this was about creating antibiotic resistance in bacteria and experiments involving cancer-causing viruses. These were the concerns. So journalists immediately noticed this emerging conversation. These are some of the headlines you can see from the New York Times, and began to wonder about potential implications for larger publics. David Baltimore agreed with the sentiments of this letter. He's seen here at the Asilomar meeting itself. He says, I was certainly concerned from the start of this that we had a responsibility outside of science and scientists, that the issue was not an issue that scientists could decide ultimately for themselves in splendid isolation from the rest of the world. And so that's why a meeting then was scheduled in February 1975 at Asilomar in splendid isolation from the rest of the world, where Paul Berg, Maxine Singer, David Baltimore, Norton Zinder, who you see seated here, Sidney Brenner, helped to organize this meeting. This Asilomar 2 meeting then, it's been forgotten, this is the second meeting, proved instrumental in producing these new kinds of safety and containment guidelines, and eventually the creation of the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee of the US National Institutes of Health. This was not an easy experience producing these guidelines, and there's memories that are quite varied about this meeting. Baltimore felt it took up, he said, an incredible amount of our time and our energy. It was emotionally draining, but he felt that it was important work as being a member of a generation that had grown up, he says, with the question of the moral correctness of the atomic bomb. So references to the atomic scientists, the development of nuclear weapons, of the bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, that's 78 years ago tomorrow and 2 days ago, right? These were everywhere in the references in 1975 at this meeting, reflecting the concerns of prominent and emerging biologists who wanted to take the time to think deeply about the potential downstream consequences of their work. In fact, Robert Pollack said at the time, and even before this meeting, we're in a pre-Hiroshima condition. It would be a real disaster if one of the agents now being handled in research should in fact be a real human cancer agent, he said. So Asilomar is often remembered as a meeting that focused on technical safety standards. And Berg opened the meeting by talking about the potential hazard from laboratory practices now underway, and he said more remote hazards that one could easily imagine, possibilities that should not be undertaken lightly. But this sense of moral responsibility also pervaded the enterprise, and several commentators at the meeting asked about what to do in the face of uncertainty as a policy question, how to deal with safety or morality, and the legal and moral responsibility that scientists might hold. These were held to be issues which transcend the scientific questions. So it's always wonderful as a historian to go into the archive and then find a folder labeled ethics right there, ethical issues. So taking the time to think deeply about the potential downstream consequences of research before engaging in it was one of the motivations, very clearly, for Asilomar. These transcendent questions mixed freely with more technical assessments of relative risk from different kinds of experiments. Which experiments can be permitted in which kinds of facilities? Your work might be risky, but not mine. Who will regulate? Can we self-regulate? And chalkboards at Asilomar raised questions of a type that are strikingly still discussed and debated today, such as with CRISPR and gene drives. One of these says, what about industrial application? What about construction of MO, perhaps that means modified organisms, parentheses, viable for intentional release? So these questions about intentional release were already being discussed at this time. The science journalist, Victor McElhaney, recalled the meeting as, quote, an incredibly tense week while young scientists whose careers were in the balance watched their seniors thrash out a final statement. Two voices warned that regulating risks that could not be quantified in advance risked bringing police into the lab. we're told. One of these voices was Jim Watson, who is said to have found the Asilomar experience, he says, an exercise in the theater of the absurd. And he later said, I found the whole Asilomar thing irrational. I think we went public too soon, he says. We should have arranged a crash series of smaller meetings over a matter of 3 months and hammered it all out first. I think we all looked forward initially, or at least a few of us did, to getting to California the following year, he said. It seemed a very nice place. How could you go wrong in a very nice place? As Janet Weinberg had noted in March of 1975, on the first day of the conference, they presented to each other with technical information on the ecology of organisms used for gene transplant research. The beckoning of an exquisite Monterey spring did not reach those inside the chapel. With shades drawn and slide projector humming, they pursued their cerebral gray obsession, she said, their slightly dangerous and exciting biotool for molding evolution. The unique language and concepts of molecular biology, she said, seemed to shelter from moral decision-making. Papers were presented when the last one was dark and the jet lag was robbing even the most obsessive of their attention. There had been no discussion, she said, of moral issues on that first day. One scientist grumbled that the presentations were too long, too technical, not illuminating of the moral issues in the question of risk versus benefit. Quote, people are only presenting the work that made them famous. They just can't resist with such an important audience. One medical microbiologist complained, if you're going to issue guidelines, you ought to understand what you're talking about. And this represented a fairly common sentiment that biochemists and molecular biologists were not trained to handle these pathogenic organisms, and yet they were devising guidelines that would impinge on the freedom of old-line microbiologists who were used to handling pathogens, it was reported. But it's Michael Rogers' brilliant account of the Asilomar conference in Rolling Stone magazine, of all places, entitled The Pandora's Box Congress, which arguably remains the best account that we have of what happened over those 4 days. And you can Google this and download this easy. It's an absolute delight to read. It's so well written, and it captures things that aren't available in any other way. Debating the ethics of human interference with the mechanics of evolution in a church at the edge of the immense saline test tube where it all started, he wrote, rarely does one find one's metaphors so cheap or so apt. Mm-hmm. We know from Rogers' account that the decisions taken at Asilomar were in a manner that only at a stretch could be called fully rational and deliberative. Watson was swearing at people. Some of the older scientists fell asleep. Some didn't hear what was being said when they voted on things. And conference organizers were forced to rush through agenda items against the clock before everybody dispersed on the last day. As Rogers saw the scene, he says scientists were, quote, discovering parliamentary procedure over beer, sitting in a chapel next to the ocean, huddled around a forbidden tree, trying to create some new commandments, and there's no goddamn Moses in sight, unquote. And despite his less than flattering portrayals of Watson's various explosions, both Watson and the executive director of the European Molecular Biology Organization, John Tooze, have referred to this account in the highest terms in their published collection of primary sources. They say it would be extremely difficult to improve upon Michael Rogers' masterly description of the atmosphere at this conference, and we shall not try. It's also the case that a presentation by some of those invited legal experts seems to have made a significant difference in the tone of the meeting. One of the invited lawyers said how the word containment was used a number of times this morning. And containment, he says, in many respects is the name of the game with respect to nuclear power. The nuclear power situation is, I believe, a paradigm of how science can advance technologically more generally. And given that nuclear power, of course, was strictly regulated and controlled by the government, the implication was clear from the lawyer that the government could step in at any moment to regulate this research. And indeed, some legislation had been introduced in Congress a short time after that to try and think of a recombinant DNA agency that might regulate just along the lines of how atomic energy had been regulated. The legal experts also suggested that a form of biological quarantine to address issues of potential workplace safety and community injury had not yet been fully appreciated by all the participants who were there. And one conference organizer recalled, while up to that point, there was a big split over whether we should say anything or do anything, these lawyers put the fear of God into everybody in that audience, including Jim. They said, you guys are vulnerable and liable. If someone in your lab comes down with anything, you're going to go to jail. You're going to be shut down. You can be sued for everything. It's very interesting to see these sorts of legal concerns that began to emerge here. And in response to that, the organizers said, we are here to explore the technological problems in the future of recombinant DNA, and many are looking to this meeting for guidance. If we don't produce it, we'll have left a serious void. If we come out split and unhappy, we'll have failed the mission in front of us, and we'll have no one to appeal to. So coming up with a summary statement was then one way of avoiding these legal liabilities as well as avoiding the prospect of imminent regulation. We have to assure and reassure the public, one conference organizer said. It's part of our job. Another participant said, if our recommendations look self-serving, we run the risk of having standards imposed on us. We must start high and work down. We can't say 150 scientists spent 4 days at Asilomar and all of them agreed there was a hazard and still they couldn't come up with a single suggestion. That would be telling the government to do it for us. It's interesting to think about some of the comments that might have resonance for us today as well. Sydney Brenner, who's here, the second from the right here, says, we live at a time when I think there's a great anti-science attitude developing in society, well developed in some societies and developing in government, and this is something we have to take into consideration. Maybe this is the end of an era, he says. It's very hard to tell in history where you really are. I think people have got to realize, he said, that there's no easy way out of this situation. With not only to say that we're going to act, we must be seen to be acting. Others, like Joshua Lederberg, were concerned that certain decisions might be crystallized into law by legislators who knew nothing about the science that they were working on and who weren't qualified to do it. Watson complained that perhaps there was no evidence here about the dangers and no ability to quantify or to understand them in advance, and that, of course, whatever regulations might be put in place, people might cheat anyhow and do other things, and that, he says, scientists must learn how to work with these dangers and be aware of these sorts of risks. So Paul Berg became increasingly upset. He's on the far right here in this image, and apprehensive here. His reputation, of course, was linked to the outcome of this. And so what happened then is on the final night, the organizers stayed awake until 4 o'clock in the morning, trying to write up what they thought would be a consensus statement that could be issued from this meeting that everybody could agree with. So there's a lot to be said here about the balance between ethical and technical reasoning and the ways in which the rediscovery of parliamentary procedure in the course of a scientific meeting becomes something that is grappled about by the participants themselves. But the exact significance of this meeting was something that was already being contested at the time with an open letter that had been sent to the meeting and in a larger series of debates and confrontations by the activist group known as Science for the People, who saw the decisions that were being made at this meeting as advancing the interests of elite researchers rather than larger publics. The consequences, they wrote, are that experiments that happen to be conceived get done regardless of whether or not they should be done. And they said, we see even in the structure of this conference that a scientific elite is here alone trying to determine the direction that regulation should take. We do not believe that the molecular biology community, which is actively engaged in the development of these techniques, is capable of wisely regulating this development alone. They write, this is like asking the tobacco industry to limit the manufacture of cigarettes. So the very nature and premise of Asilomar, was this a meeting about ethics or not, or technical safety standards and who should decide, was already contested from the very beginning, even before we get into the invocations and the later histories of it. One of the things that this inspired along the way was the design of other kinds of vectors and this idea of a disarmed host strain that they might work with, or as you see here, a lambda vector that gets renamed lambda for the people. So criticism was coming from many sides, from even the distinguished biochemist Erwin Chargaff, who was perplexed at what Asilomar was trying to do, calling it the first time in history that the incendiaries have summoned their own fire brigade. He called them the bishops of Asilomar and said they were the first in denouncing the heresies of which they themselves were guilty. He also expressed the view, have we the right to counteract irreversibly what he called the evolutionary wisdom of millions of years in order to satisfy the ambition and curiosity of a few scientists? Robert Sinsheimer of Caltech and later the chancellor of UC Santa Cruz also wrote a number of pieces in scientific and popular media expressing a series of concerns over these new recombinant DNA techniques that would make it possible to, quote, violate species barriers. This is how it's often described at the time in the mid-70s. And again, this question of whether we might be better off trusting in the so-called wisdom of evolution rather than the fallibility of humans. Quote, with the advent of synthetic biology, we leave the security of that web of natural evolution that blindly and strangely bore us all and our fellow creatures. With each step, we will be increasingly on our own. And elsewhere he wrote, let us not design a technology fit only for a rational, far-sighted, unerring, and incorruptible people. So the process of transforming the summary statement from this meeting into guidelines at both the federal level in the US and then in national policies in various countries around the world, guidelines that would then honor this so-called Spirit of Asilomar, was a long and convoluted process. One committee member involved complained at one point saying, "I think I've contracted the first illness from experiments on DNA recombinants, and that whenever I think of these guidelines or hear of them, my stomach becomes unsettled. And recently the effects appear to be spreading to my head." He imagined this was a contagious condition. At the last meeting, Berg said he was finally happy with the final draft and felt that the guidelines that had been produced at the NIH satisfied all the objections to earlier versions and that they were a faithful translation, he said, of the spirit of Asilomar. Not everyone agreed with this kind of language. The first chairman of the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee would later write, he says, that despite the many, many meetings that I have attended at Atlantic City, I've never heard a reference to the spirit of Atlantic City, this famous casino resort, right? And so he began to think about this and wondered what was going on with the scientists having these discussions and thinking about it and having to refer to the spirit of Asilomar. And he says that the experience of Asilomar was essentially a spiritual one rather than an intellectual one. It was, he said, in the usual sense, not a scientific meeting at all. And whatever its purpose may have been, he said, in the minds of its initiators, the result was to fire up the imagination, first of the newspaper correspondents, and then, he said, of a substantial number of the newspaper reading public. Even as the specific recommendations of Asilomar then came to be quickly marginalized, already by 1982, one estimate held that the guidelines no longer regulated 95% of recombinant DNA research in the United States, at least in part because of the industrialization of biotech, which was not governed by these guidelines. This was about federally funded research rather than privately funded research. And so these lessons of Asilomar came to be quite contested even early on, and this continued for some time. John Maddox, the editor of Nature in 1993, said that Asilomar was a, quote, wise decision that nevertheless left an awkward legacy. And he wrote that Asilomar has become a lightning rod for generalized anxiety about genetics in any form. What I find interesting is that the Asilomar meeting foresaw its own later invocation as an example. Participants who were there not only thought about these future concerns, they even predicted that Asilomar itself would be invoked as a precedent in these later debates. And they did so in some instances even before the meeting took place. One of the lawyers who was present there and who had addressed the group said that the fact of the moratorium and the fact that this conference is taking place, he said at the time, may well be much more important than the conclusions that may be reached on the subject matter of this conference. He says it's particularly noteworthy that the scope of the conference transcends purely scientific questions. Explicit consideration is being given over and above the question of risk and the means of minimizing that risk to these broader questions of social and moral responsibility. What you might be wondering is, did this meeting cover those broader questions or did it not? What you're seeing is the different memories that people are already expressing about this particular meeting. And he concludes his remarks by saying, hopefully this meeting will serve as a precedent, an example, a model for the scientific community to use as science progressively opens the door to highly new disruptive capabilities. So the meaning of this meeting is being debated as the meeting is happening, before the meeting was held, in the immediate aftermath, 10 years after the meeting, it's being debated. And one of the organizers, again, the later head of the NIH, Maxine Singer, would even write on the 25th anniversary of it and say, only 25 years after Asilomar, too many young scientists are unaware of or ignore the lessons of the public debate that racked our community, she said. Many of them are so burdened with advancing their careers, they have little time for public involvement or for long-range thinking. And yet, she writes, the post-75 generations of students now number among the leaders in biological research. The 1975 Asilomar conference, she said, is an ancient story for them if they know it at all. So in that sense, it's a little bit like Woodstock. So what might one learn from Asilomar and its aftermath then? This prospect of a future that was already in the 1970s called synthetic biology, possibilities opened up by recombinant DNA, had already been haunting this world of Asilomar. And what I find interesting is then that Asilomar would come to haunt the next generation of synthetic biology as well. So let me turn to this more contemporary moment then, how this spirit of Asilomar became what we might want to think of as the ghost of Asilomar, constantly haunting discussions in more contemporary areas today, whether we're talking about gene drives or CRISPR or whatever else it is that you might be working on that I haven't heard about yet. So it's very clear that Asilomar became a reference point for this emerging field of synthetic biology. Science and Nature both asked in 2004 if it was time for another synthetic biology Asilomar or for another Asilomar. And a new generation was being made aware of the legacies and the spirit of this meeting. And some prominent synthetic biologists even assigned their students Rogers's Pandora's Box Congress article from 1975 for discussion. And as early as the first international conference then, in 2004, synthetic biology was demonstrating a conscious return to this Asilomar moment and an engagement with its legacy. At the 1.0 meeting held at MIT, one participant said, in a clear echo of this specter of governance, that for synthetic biology, quote, we must set the framework for national policy or someone will do it for us. That could have been said easily in 1975 as well at the Asilomar meeting. So this frustration of trying to regulate the unknown was palpable, and the perils of not taking action were also mentioned. Within a few weeks of this meeting, one of the founders of the field, Drew Endy, concluded that Asilomar was a valuable resource for contemporary synthetic biologists. He says, I think it would be entirely appropriate to convene a meeting like Asilomar to discuss the current state and future of biological technology. And an article in Nature written a year later in 2005 reported that the past year had seen a call for an Asilomar synthetic biology, and that much of what is currently called synthetic biology is congruent with recombinant DNA technology discussed in Asilomar 30 years ago. So it's interesting that Endy was both forthright in invoking Asilomar and also being flexible in paths forward for synthetic biologists a year later when he said, a lot of people have their heads in the sand or up in the clouds about this issue. I don't know if we need another Asilomar conference, he said, but I do know it's not too early to start talking about these things. So by the time of the second international meeting for synthetic biology, the 2.0 meeting in Berkeley in California in 2006, he drew publicly and dramatically on the case of Asilomar for thinking through contemporary safety policy and regulatory challenges that might face this emerging field of synthetic biology. Invoking a contemporary new distinction between biosafety, or error, and biosecurity, or terror, he noted that the scientists who were involved at Asilomar, he said, handled safety, but they purposefully set aside security. So a town hall meeting and a workshop on biosafety and biosecurity were organized to be held a month before this 2.0 meeting on April 18th of 2006, and that's where this slide had been shared and distributed. This meeting was presented as one to consider action as a community, they said, and that it was important for these issues to be addressed. Why us? One announcement read. If you believe steps are necessary, you have a choice. Community, elites, parentheses Asilomar, right, or government. And so Asilomar is here being invoked as an elitist solution and one that could be best avoided by responsible community engagement and action. So the synthetic biology scientists are now using the science for the people claim of what Asilomar is as their own understanding of the field to advance what they think is, as you see here, a more democratic or elegant solution, as it says there at the end. So to more fully engage with these lessons of Asilomar for contemporary synthetic biology at the 2.0 meeting, where these many different meanings and histories of the field are being unfolded upon themselves, where the activist view becomes the scientist view, Endy then invited David Baltimore, one of those original organizers from Asilomar, to come and share his wisdom and to talk about this event that had taken place so many years earlier. And in a keynote address to the assembled synthetic biologists, ironically while drinking GMO-free orange juice, this was Berkeley after all, Baltimore began his remarks by commenting that Asilomar did not address everything, and some things he said, I left for your generation to work out. And then he began to narrate his own interpretation of what Asilomar did and did not do. And so in his keynote address in 2006, rather than see Asilomar as a religious revival, he framed it as a purely technical event, where conversations were focused exclusively on issues of safety and explicitly did not involve matters of ethical concern. He noted that some topics were deliberately excluded from the meeting. Quote, there is clearly an unfinished agenda from Asilomar in the area of biowarfare, he said. Other issues that he talked about were already very familiar in 1975. The ethical issues, he said, should we be mixing up genomes from different organisms? Should we be modifying genomes or organisms? Should we be thinking about gene therapy, all of which was very evident at the time, he said, we didn't consider for one core reason. And that core reason, he said, was that we weren't the people to consider that. Asilomar was a meeting of scientists. We were not pretending to speak for the public. We were speaking for our community. We felt that we were the people to decide whether there was a danger and there wasn't a danger in these situations. And that if we couldn't decide, then no one could decide. And I think that was correct, unquote. The funny thing about history, though, is that it's not the same thing as memory or tales told around the campfire. And we know from the opening remarks made at Asilomar in 1975 that questions of safety and morality were definitely part of the motivation for the conference. Paul Berg's opening remarks during the first 20 minutes of the meeting explicitly invoked, quote, safety or morality, and referred to, quote, issues which transcend the scientific questions, and, quote, what to do in the face of uncertainty as a policy question. And this was characterized as a, quote, legal and moral responsibility, right? And so in 1974, even David Baltimore himself had described his generation as having, quote, grown up with the question of the moral correctness of the atomic bomb, drawing by implication this was a motivating factor for the meeting. So this sort of after-the-fact narration of Asilomar is a strictly science-oriented event that focused only on technical questions of risk, which is what he's presenting to the synthetic biology audience, and that excluded considerations of anything but strictly scientific understandings of safety, reflects a later consolidation of what counts as a lesson of Asilomar. It's a reconstruction of the past that began shortly after public interest in recombinant DNA exploded, when many scientists felt disappointed that their best efforts to be thoughtful, socially responsible, and ahead of the curve at Asilomar only seemed to lead to their being derided as self-interested elitists by critical journalists, activists, and politicians. And Maxine Singer referred to this point in her life as a nightmare that she never wanted to live through again. So this retrenchment in the meaning of Asilomar, that Asilomar was not about ethics, intensified over the years until it became the received narrative then that was then articulated as wisdom to a younger generation of synthetic biologists. And this was less a strategic amnesia about what happened 30 years earlier than the lived experience of someone like Baltimore having to reinterpret the meaning of Asilomar repeatedly over the course of his career as circumstances, opportunities, and challenges changed. So rather than putting the ghost of Asilomar to bed, Baltimore's keynote was resurrected then on the third day of this Synthetic Biology 2.0 meeting, which the organizers had devoted to ethics, risk, and safety issues, the same sort of mix as found at the original meeting. There were 4 non-technical items on the agenda: biological safety and security, the understanding and perception of synthetic biology, ownership, sharing, and innovation, and what they called community organization. And it was also a planned day for discussion of what was called a proposed Synthetic Biology 2.0 declaration, which some critics would soon come to bill as Asilomar 2.0, even though there was already 2 Asilomar conferences, right? So it's interesting how this meeting then received some pushback from some familiar entities and groups here. So Andy, one of these founders of the field, was careful to insist, he said, that we are not here today as participants of an Asilomar 2.0 meeting or something like that. Remember what he had said just a few years before, where he thought that would be a very good idea, right? He says, rather, we're here to discuss and decide how best to act to leave here with plans to work with all groups, from government to industry to public benefit organizations, anyone whose goal is to improve the human condition, and to work with us to do that. And so despite having been advertised as a kind of updated Asilomar, remember there's options for how things could organize on that community day, and the idea that there would be this proposed declaration that was here, and remember that Baltimore had been invited specifically to deliver a keynote on Asilomar and its lessons, repeated efforts were very quickly made then to assiduously distance the new synthetic biology from the old field of Asilomar. And why the change? A vigorous response then from a coalition of more than 36 public interest groups, believed to have been led by the ATC group based in Ottawa, Canada, had distributed an open letter of protest. So history appears to be repeating itself in an interesting way here. They portrayed this 2.0 meeting as, you can see here, Asilomar 2.0. And they referred to that 1975 meeting as preempting public debate and preventing government action. Synthetic Biology 2.0 follows the same road of self-regulation, and this narrow focus on questions delays regulation, forestalls discussion of how to address wider socioeconomic impacts. And the famous line here, Asilomar proved to be the wrong approach then, and Synthetic Biology 2.0 is the wrong approach now. So upon learning of the letter from these assembled groups here, conference organizers decided then not to proceed with a general vote on any sort of principles of self-regulation or a code of conduct, things which had been modeled and offered as a model for engagement at the 1.0 meeting. And while this had previously been seen as a forward-thinking move that synthetic biologists might do well to consider, the new reality on the ground by 2006 meant that any of these self-regulatory actions could be run the risk of being perceived as closed-shop governance by elites. And so important and large-reaching discussions would take place about risk, safety, and public involvement, but ultimately no action on self-governance itself was taken. Internal debate was raging among conference organizers about how to respond to this challenge from these civil society groups. Do you respond or do you let it go? Randy Retberg, the head of the International Genetically Engineered Machines competition, asked. I can't imagine the right thing to do as a response, because what that's going to do is get the press completely covering the conflict, not covering the commonality, he said, not covering the issues. Andy clarified his own view. The purpose of our declaration is not to revisit an Asilomar-like resolution for how we're governing ourselves, but rather to describe the process by which we're going to make progress on these issues. And so then, would there be a vote on these conference declarations? And he says no. That was an unfortunate miscommunication about what was going to happen today. As confusing as matters looked from the conference floor, I've learned there's even more drama behind closed doors, references to vehement, ferocious, and theatrical events leading to a total breakdown, according to some accounts. My point here is that both promoters and critics of synthetic biology could re-narrate the history of the years since Asilomar to bolster their claims. And the events at this 2.0 meeting in 2006 then showed how a variety of folk histories of Asilomar and its spirit were being articulated and coming into conflict in new ways. An account offered as a keynote address by one of the most famous of the Asilomar organizers himself was juxtaposed to competing narratives offered by a lawyer advocating community involvement rather than elite decision-making, whose own proposal for finding a, quote, elegant and democratic solution was then torpedoed by still another interpretation by civil society groups that saw such a proposal itself as instantiating Asilomar 2.0, a label which conference organizers then had first adopted and later did everything to avoid as circumstances change, as the meaning of Asilomar became co-opted. So for a session at a conference that was emphatically and repeatedly described as not another Asilomar, one could be forgiven for thinking otherwise. To a historian's eyes, it was just as if a group of scientists were once again, quote, trying to create some new commandments and there's no goddamn Moses in sight, to quote Michael Rogers' article, right? And in the years since that meeting, references to Asilomar in the synthetic biology community began to accelerate. By 2007, ND changed his tune a bit. He says, I don't care to rehash all the conversations around recombinant DNA and self-governance with respect to what happened 30 years ago until there are pressing reasons to do so, because the safety record isn't bad, he said, and the benefits in terms of discovery and applications are pretty compelling. And by 2008, he declared that Asilomar was about, quote, outside non-academic people coming in and doing things in the field, rather than a gathering of elite scientists to discuss strictly scientific issues of biosafety, which is what Baltimore had said it was. And so ND's own understanding of what the spirit of Asilomar was continued to change. If you're starting to get confused, this is what's interesting about how it operates in this way, right? So both promoters and critics narrate the history of these years in many ways, and these different accounts were coming into conflict as they were being articulated. And as young synthetic biologists were instructed to study and to learn from and perhaps even admire Asilomar as a model, many social scientists began to echo the critique of Science for the People and later activist groups and consolidated their own STS understanding of Asilomar as closed-door elite governance that bears not even a passing resemblance to open, deliberative, and democratic process. So it seems there are many different Asilomars. References to Asilomar continued to accelerate. It was either a menacing wraith or an insubstantial presence that could mean everything and its opposite, but could also be deployed in devastatingly effective ways. And the prime example of such an approach was probably a poster submitted to the poster session of the 3.0 meeting held in Zurich in June of 2007, submitted by the same group that had led that open letter that was distributed at the 2.0 meeting. This was their poster in the scientific poster session. Designed around a devastatingly creative and graphically compelling theme, evoking the Little Shop of Horrors with white-coated scientists falling into the maw of Audrey, the carnivorous plant, the ETC group indicted synthetic biology for running what they called a little closed shop of governance. This was again a claim of Asilomar as elitism redux. So I find it remarkable that this meeting is still invoked in so many different competing ways 48 years later, which is one of the reasons why I began working on this project recently, thinking this 50th anniversary is coming up and there's a lot to unpack and to think about the meaning and the significance and the legacies of this meeting, especially as it will continue to be invoked in a year and a half's time. So it's resurrected time and time again. The Atlantic magazine recently referred to a conference on Cas9 as the, quote, spiritual successor to Asilomar. And there are many invocations of Asilomar at the third international meeting on human genome editing that took place this past March, and also, of course, some new references to Asilomar principles for AI and many other things that have drawn our attention this spring as well. So I'm fascinated by the echoes of this conversation and this dynamic over time. The technologies may change, the politics may evolve, but the narrative frames and the contestations remain disturbingly familiar. Asilomar has morphed from being a place, an event, and a spirit to a ghostly invocation that seems to haunt every science society question of social responsibility, and it's often insubstantial in form, but powerful in effect. And this was also foreseen by the Asilomar generation. The ethicist Daniel Callahan noted in 1977 that there has yet to be a good public discussion, and worse, the discussion doesn't seem to be getting any better. It's boringly repetitive in substance and tediously hysterical in tone. It's simply not enough to affirm the high principle that the public should have a role in decision-making and there should be public forums and public debates. What ought to be the content of that discussion? By what criteria ought the public to judge the competing scientific and ethical cases that have been made by now? I love this line. For the public should not only be heard, the public ought also to think. But what is it supposed to think about? So where shall we stand in this great dispersion of Asilomars? Marx held that history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. But perhaps the novelist Julian Barnes's amendment to this famous maxim catches an important feature here, where he says, no, that's too grand, too considered a process. History just burps, and we taste again that raw onion sandwich it swallowed centuries ago. And Nature concluded in 2015 that we are now in a moment after Asilomar. And even in the most recent contemporary discussions about the implications of CRISPR, the director of the U.S. National Academies of Science wondered whether Asilomar was still the right model. So have we reached peak Asilomar then? And today, 48 years after Asilomar, it can't be made to disappear or to be buried. It's resurrected in countless new contexts and frequently in questions of therapy and enhancement and beyond. I just referred to that Atlantic article that recently came out. So from the specter of governance that causes concern among scientists involved in developing emerging technologies, to the idea that there are lessons from the history of Asilomar, through just what those lessons are remains something that's very unclear and contested. And then to the competing understandings of the role of the public, there's kind of a constant eerie familiarity in the ways in which Asilomar serves as a reference point for disputation, even as it's invoked in contradictory ways. So Asilomar is then, to use a French term, a revenant. It constantly comes back as a ghost. And I love that you can see that in the French itself, the thing that comes back again, right? Shape-shifting, indeterminate, but always haunting the field as similar terms and people and issues and debates emerge and reemerge over the span of decades. But perhaps the best reason to think of Asilomar as a ghost is that it's not ever past, much less buried. It's constantly killed off. It constantly comes back to life. And so it is, we might say, undead. So I'm suggesting then that Asilomar is not just a method of resolution, which is how it's often invoked as a model or something that should be followed and reproduced in some way, but it's an expression of a complex cultural dynamic that will always be operative whenever and wherever we explore these interfaces of science and society. The quandary is not a conceptual one to be solved once and for all, but a practical and inescapable politically one that is being lived in every moment. Community solutions may not always be elegant, in other words, but messy. And so I think we need to reject the Asilo myth, what one journalist has called the belief that referencing Asilomar will magically solve the issues. And when we do so, instead of a time-honored solution, we might find time and context-dependent insights and approaches that work in one time and place, and perhaps not in another. And so even though whatever course of action we might take might still be interpreted otherwise by our interlocutors, our opponents, our successors, it remains our duty to do the best that we can, one might argue, to live up to the spirit of Asilomar, even if what we said 30 years ago about the proper relations of science and society might seem to contradict what we hold to be an important insight today. And even if we don't agree with each other on what living up to that spirit would look like, or even agree on that as a goal. So I will fully admit that as a conclusion, this is entirely unsettling. But then again, ghost stories always are. So thank you for listening.
So much. Should we stop presenting? Thank you so much, Lewis. That was just so rich and yeah, so many spectres. And it's there'll be a really good discussion going on now. So I would like to ask Elise Pibay to come up. So she is an NHMRC Senior Research Fellow and Principal Research Fellow at Melbourne University and Royal Melbourne. She's a member of the ARC College of Experts, Director of Genetic Cures Australia, and Adjunct Associate Professor at University of Western Australia Centre for Ophthalmology and Visual Science, and many other things, as well as the Scientific Advisory Board member of companies, and her research uses patient-specific pluripotent stem cells to model neurodegenerative diseases of the eye and brain. And she has made she's got 3 international patents on stem cells. So she does the stuff every day that Asilomar and its spectres are trying to talk about and make interventions in. So, Elise.
Thank you. And it's a really hard task to unpack everything you've said. It was so interesting and so rich, I would say, of content. So thank you very much for at least for enlightening all of us, but you've enlightened me very much. So thank you. I've taken a few notes during for the noise. And the first thing I would like to say, if it was either technical or a spiritual meeting, does it really matter? I found the word spiritual funny for scientists because it's already by itself a reductionist approach, in the sense that you have to believe in spirituality to think it was a spiritual meeting. Anyway, I don't think that the point is really about being technical or spiritual. What is, however, very important is that you can still hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The sound is cutting for me. Is that the points are all still very much relevant? In particular, I mean, we talk about ethical considerations and guidelines. These are relevant in our everyday work, at least, and I'm sure we can think of them in everyday's life, in everyone's life, in everybody's job. These are really important points to cover still. The need to balance innovation with safety and regulation is more than ever important today. I can give plenty of examples where this is needed. For instance, we talked about gene therapy. You talked about gene editing, where we modify gene either in an embryo or in a non-somatic cell down the track. I think the advent of artificial intelligence is also something that needs to be thought about when we think about innovation, safety and regulation. How do we balance all of this? Of course, stem cells, we've talked about stem cells for over 20 years, so we know more about those, but also designing new cells. We've got artificial cells that we make today that are designed to kill all the cells in our body. Similarly, we are designing new antibodies that will help us in therapy, but could do much more other stuff. So there are a lot of technical advances today that really need, I don't know if it's guidelines, but at least we need to think about them to make sure we understand at least the start of the potential, really. The third point, collaboration, collaborative decision-making, collaboration, governance, and regulation, all of this being in a collaborative way. I think this is really important. But with this, I think the world has changed, and they are from almost 50 years ago, and I think there are limitations to an approach like this. Yes, the world is global, this is true, but it is not so much global in the way we deal with science. Some countries have different type of ethical guidelines, they have a different type of regulations, and nothing is really taken at the global level. We see it every day when we try to fight climate change. We are global without being global in our decision making. So that point about collaboration, I think, is essential, and we need to resolve it. And I think that's why it's still relevant today, but it's not so much addressed, I would say, in a sufficient way. Transparency and open dialogues, public engagement are similarly very important, and that I will come back to this later in terms of the Asilomar meeting, if we were to have this approach again, because I think these are really key to today's world and problems we have. And finally, thinking of unintended consequences. How do we do that? How are we training the mind to be able to understand such a complex world we live in, at least in medicine and in technology, to foresee those unintended consequences, which was, I think, an important point of the meeting as well. And so all those points, I think, are very important in today's world. I don't know if we need to meet to find solutions, but we certainly need to think of them. And with thinking of them, who should think about it? I think everyone should be thinking about those things, but if we look at the education system today, who's learning about science? Who's learning about medicine? Our politicians, who are decision makers, are never trained in science. This is not an important subject for them to become politicians. Yet they will make decisions for us on those very issues because they will legislate on those issues for us. So when we go about collaborative global approach and transparency, I think this comes back to education. It is really important to do all of those things and know who would be participating to a debate. But to participate to such an important debate, we need to go there with an informed approach to that debate. And I don't know that in today's world, which is fast, which is competitive, which is global without being global, we've got all the tools we need to be able to answer these questions globally. And that brings me back to my last point, really, which is, to me, you raised the point about elitism. Do we need the elite to think about those points, or do we need the community as a whole to think about those points? Well, do we need education to think about those points? At the end of the day, they concern all of us, that we're educated in science or not. I think these are really important questions when we select, and if we select the people who should contribute to these debates. To me, and it's a very vague answer, I would say that to combat elitism, we need to fight it with education. And I think that has to be the core of all those discussions. It has to come back from the ground and going back up. Educate people to understand these questions, these vast questions, for us to find solutions together. So that was really enlightening, and I hope I contributed a tiny bit with my thoughts on this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie. So maybe we'll hear what Evie has to say and then get a response, and then we'll open it up. So Evie Kendall is a bioethicist and public health researcher at the Department of Health Sciences and Biostatistics at Swinburne University of Technology. She completed her Bachelor of Biomedical Science in 2008 in Human Pathology and Behavioural Neuroscience, then studied comparative literature and cultural studies, Latin and philosophy. So she's done a Master of Bioethics and a PhD in Bioethics, and also a Master of Public Health. And her research interests, as you can tell from her training, are very diverse, but centering on ethical dilemmas in emerging technologies, space ethics, and public health ethics. So Evie, please, would love to hear what you think.
Okay, can you hear me? Yep. So first of all, thank you so much for the fantastic talk, Professor Campos, and obviously I know everyone will have things that they want to say about it. A lot of my comments are actually very similar to Elisa's, so forgive me for that. But the thing that really struck me listening to the example is how it's such a great example of the spirit of bioethics in its entirety as well. So many of these things, like the conflict between having a precautionary principle versus stifling research that could save lives, is something that we're always challenged with. So there's often a perceived conflict between scientific progress and ethics, which is obviously very unfair because good science is ethical. And one of the roles of an ethics committee, of course, is to critique the methodology and make sure it's rigorous and repeatable, which obviously makes good science. I loved the phrase about ethics being deployed as tactics for competing legacies, because I think that's a fair point. I can't remember who you were citing there, but a fantastic sort of commentary on how ethics is sometimes misused, and sometimes there is that focus on ethics only comes in if there's a liability issue. So you talked about the legalities and how getting scientists on board sometimes meant telling them that there would be legal consequences if they didn't get engaged. But I think one of the things that I found most interesting was that idea that the scientists pausing was the most momentous and unprecedented element of the Asilomar sort of event. And that sort of highlights the cooperation involved even in achieving that meeting. So like Elise, I was thinking, do we actually have that cooperation anymore, or are we too much in conflict, too much in that sort of nationalism for global cooperation? So thinking about those examples like banning DDTs and CFCs and these things that had this massive global cooperation, and the fact that we can't seem to replicate that in things like our pandemic response. We haven't been able to replicate that with other climate sort of change mitigation strategies. So That's a concern in terms of, can we achieve this kind of thing again? Can we get a self-regulatory movement that would have any sort of authority, if that's how some people interpret the Asilomar guidelines, like they have some meaning to some people? And again, for bioethicists, we often get told that if something can be done, it will be done. There's this techno-determinist, almost fatalistic response, versus human beings being able to say that is enough. We're not going to cross that boundary. We're not going to cross that line. And that ties into that very common myth of the slippery slope. So we heard about that with people saying we couldn't have marriage equality because then people would marry a bridge. And obviously that hasn't happened. It's a myth. The slippery slope is not really something that we see happening in the real world. But again, those conflicts of interest that you mentioned in terms of, can the scientists be trusted to self-regulate? If they self-regulate, does that actually have authority? Should the community be more involved in that? I think these are problems that we see right across the board. And as Elise mentioned, of course, we've got politicians who are making decisions who don't have that science background. And we see this in health all the time. The people regulating other people's bodies don't know how those bodies work. Like, they really don't understand the basic biology and science there, and how that is leading to a lot of suffering. So is it time for another Asilomar? I sort of asked the question, would it even work? Do we have that ability to cooperate? Would we actually respect the results of such a meeting were it to happen now? Is it too elitist? Is it undemocratic, as we heard? But I think the upshot of all of that is, if we want this kind of self-regulation to work, if we want community regulation to come in, we really need that interdisciplinary approach. So we need to have the scientists who understand what's actually being done in terms of not just what we have now, but emerging technologies, emerging synthetic biology, for example. But also the policymakers, have them at the table at the time, have the ethicists involved, and obviously the historians. This historical account is obviously very valuable to get us thinking about where does the authority come from in an event like this, in a meeting like this. Can we actually get that corporation to come up with some guidelines for where we want to draw that boundary, where we say this is enough and humans aren't going to cross that particular line? So that was just what it highlighted to me, the real importance of, as we heard, education, but particularly interdisciplinary education. So the fact that everyone brings something different to the table for these kind of discussions. But again, thank you very much. That's all I have to add there. So
thank you both for very interesting comments to think about what are the possible meanings for us as reflecting on this historical case today. I think what I find really interesting thinking it through is that we often need to and must appeal to these ideas of collaboration, of transparency, of making sure that people are involved and there's an inclusive process, that democratic representation. What I think I like about looking very carefully at the history of it is how those invocations are, of course, what we need to do, and yet when they actually play out, it's so much more messy than those invocations make it seem, and positions change, and something that might have been an outsider activist critique becomes the internal name and identity of the field as it presents it. So the ways in which time is an interesting dimension for analyzing how these dynamics play out is something that I think history can offer to a larger world of STS that thinks about these sorts of issues. That it may not always be, situations may not look the same, frameworks might look different, positions may change into exactly the opposite over a particular span of time. And that's a methodological game that I like to play. When I see something that's being said today, I immediately look back and try and wonder, how would this have been expressed in an earlier decade, 30 years before, 50 years before? Is there something that I can get from seeing how technology is different, the context is different, and the claim is familiar, but perhaps uttered by the exact unexpected person who would be. And what does that help me understand about how these dynamics and discourses evolve and change that surprise me? That I'm not always going to be kind of concluding the same sort of thing when I see how the history actually unfolds. And so that's just something that I find really interesting to think about with these cases, these shifting positions over time. I think another thing that I might want to offer, perhaps as a strong criticism of my own take, is perhaps to say what I want to offer is that Asilomar is nothing special. it gets invoked as a model, but in fact, it's a scientific conference, like many other scientific conferences that happen to have these journalists who are there, and the circumstances for its emergence are rather different than some others. But it's not that something magical happened there, where they knew how to create a summary statement that they knew would lead to committees that would lead to the next step. It's the same sort of process of a scientific community encountering an issue, a pressing issue that it wants to address and to resolve. And so then where is that desire to want to find a model from an earlier decade that we think that our ancestors in the field have somehow figured these things out, and we just need to return to them and invite them as the keynote speaker to say something that will somehow resolve our issues? Now, of course, there's wisdom to be had from hearing how something has been grappled with before, but the ways in which this has turned into, I think, a paradigm or a model, or the many sorts of references that Asilomar has this long afterlife, if you think about it, it's downright bizarre. It says something about our own desires for fixity, for surety of meaning, for thinking if only we find the right model or example to work with, then we can solve this messy political, ethical, complex technical sort of issue that we're dealing with. And I think one thing that telling a history like this helps to explore is to rehumanize what has become an abstracted, perfected sort of model that somehow we should live up to, or somehow is too 1970s and not what we need for it to be today. And therefore we have gone past it, right? That was only elitist, or that was only this other sort of framework. And I think by seeing how these positions destabilize and constantly invert over time, we can, by humanizing the process, by the people involved in it, we can be much more critical of the steps that we want to take now. I find it very interesting, for instance, that it has become almost a commonplace in our field of STS to think of Asilomar as this elite technical gathering and meeting, and to miss the ethical motivations that were very clearly there affecting that generation that wanted to host this meeting. So certainly not everybody who was in the room was everybody who could have been in the room. These are things we can readily acknowledge, right? The world has changed quite a bit. When you listen to the audio recordings of the meeting, one of the most striking things that you notice is it's a room full of men, and the laughter and the smoke that you imagine coming out of the cigarettes everywhere. I mean, it's a radically different world in many different ways to think about. But I think there's something to be gained from thinking of Asilomar as nothing special in particular. And in that sense, the ways in which it gets adapted and taught to younger generations. And I remember one case at the European Molecular Biology Organization in Heidelberg where they had a meeting a number of years ago, and a postdoc stood up and he said, you know, you're referring to this meeting and to these decisions. And he said, that was 1975. That was all before I was born. How can it be that these things have been decided with that technology then, and that I don't have a role to say what I think this should be now? And so the idea of having to relive this and rework it in every moment, I think, is something that's very useful in a way that that telling this history brings it, in a sense, back to life for us, right? It helps us to critique those assumptions that this is somehow an easy, unproblematic model, or something that we've gotten past and now we have a better way of doing things. I think both of those things are too simplistic, and recognizing the humanity of the interaction is really important. So thank you both for those comments. I'm sure there's other questions and comments out there. So
yeah, we'll keep you up there. I've got yeah, we've got questions. Yes, Jeff. So what we just might see, just ask the question from there, and if the online audience can't hear you, I will just paraphrase or repeat.
What surprised me is that there were indeed journalists invited there, and a photographer, and including a photographer. And usually when at conferences, you think, well, there's no kind of photographers there the whole time. Did this mean they planned it this way, or they knew how important it was, so they invited a journalist and a photographer there? Do you think they overblew themselves with that?
I think there was a sense that this was going to be an important meeting that was going to cover something that had already been covered in the newspapers, this moratorium that had taken place, and that this was the moment to get clarity, to have the discussion to determine whether or not that moratorium could be ended and research could proceed. And given the already extant public interest in it, I think that was one of the motivations for making sure that it would be covered by a broad range of journalists who they brought in. They were under strict restrictions to not report until after the conference was over. And of course, this is in an era when you have to run to the telephone and make the call to your editor and read the story over the line to them, right? And so the ways in which information got out is a different dynamic than today. This is certainly something to think about, right? Having an international Zoom meeting of that third international meeting that just happened, in March, where everybody can watch from around the world in real time and see something happen, as of course happened a few years ago in the earlier case. That's a quite different dynamic than a space where you can tell everyone you have to be here for everything, have your conversations, and then you can report at the end. what comes out. So I think they were very conscious that this was something that would have a larger impact. Not everyone was invited, however, and that's why I think it's extraordinary that this, of journalists, I think it's extraordinary that Rolling Stone ends up being the best possible account to cover a scientific conference as if it were, a rock and roll concert. Is this article has stood the test of time.
Yes.
Hi, I'm John Webb from Swinburne University. And if you look at me, you might guess that I was around about that time at the Asilomar conference. I wasn't there, but I was at Caltech as a PhD student at that time. So one of the things that I was always conscious of with Asilomar, it was being talked about in the chemistry, biochemistry, postgrad world or groups at Caltech. Sinsheimer was he was the dean of biology. So he was a senior figure in that. And we kind of thought he was being a bit cautious. He was a bit, we just wanted to keep going and do whatever we were doing and not be stopped back by the old guy. It wasn't going to let us keep going. But the fact that there's a couple of things I'd like to mention I think are important. Maybe at least you were thinking about this word spiritual. You have to remember this was California in the 70s. And the smoke that was probably being blown around may not have been tobacco smoke. And it was Monterey, that's Big Sur, it's encounter groups, it's all kinds of communal psychology going on in that environment. And that was, I think, would be a factor in the dynamic within the discussions. But the last thing I'd like to mention is that there are a lot of examples of people, communities trying to resolve those issues of technical opportunities and difficult issues. And there are a whole range of them. You mentioned, I think, the Montreal, did you mention Montreal or the ozone layer, climate change, Antarctica, chemical weapons? There's a whole range of these things which have in some ways been resolved, but at the same time are different from what you're talking about. I loved your talk and I appreciated it very much. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think you're right that the smoke is more complicated than I was letting on in the context there. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that there's a number of examples that we could appeal to of other ways in which international agreements have been made, right? And there's several different levels from treaties on down of how agreements could be made in place. What I think is interesting about Asilomar as an example is that it was intended to be international. What that means is, of course, fairly restricted at that time in the 1970s. And yet, if you look at how it played out in the American versus the European context, it's, of course, quite different. And the ways in which it became a direct kind of feed-in through the American process, it didn't operate that way in European context. And so this past spring, I've run 2 different conferences looking at it in both sides of the Atlantic to think about what are those relevant differences. And we had a conference we just did in Paris in the middle of June, where we're kind of going from Germany to Italy to France to see how did this the returning scientists from these places come back and become the national expertise for their local contexts without necessarily it becoming a governmental process. And so to think about those intersections of what governance looks like when you have an international scientific meeting that very clearly is tied to one national context and yet can play out in very different ways in other places, that's a really important part of the story that I'm keen to know more about.
Yeah, so Karina's got an online question. She's going to read out or comment.
Don, I don't know if it's Don Press, or maybe that's an abbreviation. Just a comment that from a historical perspective, it's worth considering how the Spirit of Asilomar differed from earlier conferences, such as the 1962 SIBO conference or the bioethics-oriented 1971 Hastings NIH conference.
Yeah, so that is interesting. This conference, it does have this kind of this mid-70s post-atomic world ethical concern motivation surrounding it, which is very different than, for instance, that SIBO conference on the future of man and the kinds of transhumanist possibilities of what might be coming next. Something has shifted rather dramatically from the early 60s into the mid-70s. I think in that sense, to refer to it as the Spirit of Asilomar, to see this, whatever DeWitt Stettin was identifying as the spiritual aspect of the conference that he thought was bizarre and strange from other conferences, is reflecting that sort of wanting to be ethically conscious and engaged with a potentially hazardous new technology that was nevertheless very exciting. I mean, the point of the meeting was in order to end the moratorium and to figure out what the right guidelines would be to go ahead. That sort of meeting, that is rather different than earlier meetings that had taken place. And I think that's very perceptive to kind of note that this is quite different. And that matches what Susan Wright had mentioned in her molecular politics. This was this unprecedented moment in the history of biology that scientists would do this.
Yeah, I've got just a question, Chair's prerogative. So it's kind of like two-part question. So in the regulation of AI discussions that are happening now, which maybe is this decade's version of Asilomar, or the issue that is causing the most kind of ethical concerns, there's this critique that it's all really hype, that when you have the executives of these companies going before the US Congress, it's actually, and talking about how AI might end the world, it is just about, talking themselves up and making them seem much more important than they actually are. So the first question is, like, do you see any of this critique of, Asilomar as just hype? And, we could say from the 70s until now, could argue that, there hasn't been this incredible change in molecular biology, and, they were, overblown what the dangers might be. So, is that a critique that you hear of the conference itself? And then my second question is kind of like saying, having this conversation, having this analysis in the present, is there, if you're talking about, dangers of genetic technologies, you're kind of doing it in the shadow of He Zhonghui's kind of unauthorized gene editing of children, which actually was revealed at this kind of Asilomar version of the first gene editing ethics conference. So that's very dramatic. So, is that kind of part of what got you thinking about this? Because that was kind of Asilomar gone terribly wrong in a way. But then also the kind of ongoing speculations about whether COVID-19 was a lab leak, and it seems to keep on going, this speculation, and I don't think it's just conspiracy theorists. I think there seems to be quite high level speculation. So that would imply that it's not like overblown at all, but these dangers are really very real and very present. So respond to that.
Well, there's a lot there. This is a wonderful question. So I did not begin the project because of Zhonghui. I can say that. I've been following this for a number of years, trying to piece together from many different archives and places who had been speaking about these issues in the history of Asilomar, but it certainly brought it into clarity and focus that this is exactly the sort of kind of gathering that is following in the Asilomar model, right? That it has those resonances and those echoes. That's very much the case. I think it took on a new focus and intensity for me when those sorts of lab leak theories began to come out. And I began to wonder, well, this sounds very much like what I've heard the debate and the discussion being in the 70s. The concern was to prevent a potential pandemic from taking place. And in fact, then I dug in deeper and I realized that there were lots of references to Michael Crichton's Andromeda strain that were being made at the time of Asilomar. This is the novel that was published in 1969. It's a film that came out a few years later about this pandemic from space, or maybe it was biowarfare from military satellite. The story's a little unclear. It's told differently in the book and in the movie. And so I began to look through these notes that I had gathered for other purposes, and I saw that this sort of biosecurity, bioterror, bioweapon angle was, of course, discussed in the 1970s. And it had weird echoes for me then to be reading the 1970s stories about these concerns and then hear these things about COVID-19 in the present moment. And so then I decided I have to write this up. I sent a little piece off to Science about it, looking at these kinds of strains of Andromeda, as I called it, these ideas of why is it that one needs to be responsible and speculate about the potential risks of a newly emerging technology in order to be on the ball and thinking about what might happen. But if you go too far, then it sounds like irresponsible speculation and just becomes science fiction. And so what is that line between science and science fiction, responsible speculation, irresponsible speculation? And is it a line that's conceptual or intellectual, or is it a line about who is making the speculation. And so by looking at that case of how Michael Crichton's story was actually part of the Asilomar discussions in the 70s, helped me think in new and interesting ways about these sorts of issues, biopolitical issues coming up in the last few years. The first question.
Hype.
Yeah, the hype. So this ties in quite interestingly, because that was definitely a concern that was raised early on when some of the more critical positions would write, for instance, a New York Times Magazine feature about the dangerous strains that are going to kill us as a response to these discussions of recombinant DNA. And it made some of the organizers at Asilomar meetings so upset that proper, distinguished scientists doing these sorts of things would engage in that as their way of engagement with the larger public. They would produce this kind of rhetoric that would be of deep concern at the time. And so the hype at that moment was, who are the scientists who are not being responsible in the ways that they are pitching this for larger discussion? I think now we have a concern of hype that, as you mentioned, is this a way of building a business? And this has, of course, changed with the rise of biotechnology after that, right? The idea that there is skin and profit in the game was a potential vision in 1975 that became realized through the 1980s and quite would play out differently now. And so that, I think, is something that, that when you look at synthetic biology, as it was getting started, Drew Endy, one of those founding figures of the field, kept on saying how revolutionary this field was, how new it was to think of a way of engineering life where you could have modular parts and an abstraction hierarchy and all these things. And this is not like how biologists do it. And it's fine if they don't like how biologists do it. We're doing something new. And as a civil engineer, he teamed up with a computer science expert and with an internet technology person, and they created this field of synthetic biology as kind of the narrative that's there. And the Europeans looked at this and they said, this is absurd. These are molecular techniques we've been using for decades. This is typical American salesmanship, that they come along and say that they've invented this field, and now it's this new and revolutionary thing. And so it's interesting to watch that dynamic that happens, but then it's also interesting to watch as the field starts to look for larger funding from the US government in particular, and he goes and testifies before Congress. And the story is not that this is a new and revolutionary field, but that these are the same techniques we've been doing for a long time. This is just the next step of genetic engineering, and that there's nothing new to be concerned about. This falls under all of our already existing regulatory structures that we have in place. And so in that case, the hype is part of constructing and building a sense of community in the field in the beginning, and especially getting younger students interested in what biology could be as a technology. But when it comes to wanting to reassure the regulators who also hold the purse strings, then it becomes nothing new in particular, and the hype gets downplayed a bit. And yet, other synthetic biologists then turn and look at some other very prominent people in the field who are regularly making extraordinary claims for what synthetic biology could do. And they see that as part of a particular machine for generating interest and profit in speculative ventures in a way that doesn't match their understanding of what a proper science should look like. So I think there are lots of interesting resonances and echoes of how hype plays out in different ways and how it looks different as the bioeconomy emerges and then becomes something that governments fund rather than something that is industry funded, or rather than something that has no potential for funding in the earliest days.
So going from this is very shiny and interesting to nothing to see here.
I think there's also some things we don't know. So one of the things that came up at the Houston meeting when I invited Matthew Cobb, who's a Drosophilist from Manchester, to come and present on his work on the field, was that he had begun to uncover that some of the Soviet scientists who had attended the Asilomar meeting, who are not fully kind of understood by Michael Rogers of who they are and what they're doing, he dug into it and found out who they were, and they were among the top leaders of the Soviet bioweapons program. So what does it mean that this meeting, which is not supposed to be about biowarfare and is explicitly kind of labeled out of consideration, partially because we just signed some bioweapons treaties at around that time that may have made Baltimore feel that this wasn't necessary to engage in this in greater depth, that in fact the quiet men in the back of the room who didn't appear to be paying much attention or understanding things were among the top leaders of that program. I think there's many things that we have yet to learn about these sorts of international dynamics, about hype, about potential misuse, that I think looking at that historical case can help us imagine what we have yet to understand about today. So.
I think that's a brilliant point to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.